Welcome back. Today we're going to look into a little more detail on the labor market. Last time we looked in general at factor markets, but we'll look more specifically at labor today. And we'll try and learn how to derive the market supply curve for labor and explain why the labor supply curve for individuals looks the way it does. We'll talk about what would cause a shift in the labor supply curve. And then we'll move to a more broad understanding of factor markets, looking at how to analyze imperfect competition as well as perfect competition. All this information is going to be in Chapter 20 of your book, Factor Markets and the Distribution of Income. When it comes to labor supply, you have to keep in mind that it's the employee who is the supplier of labor. So when you think of factor markets and you think of labor, you think about what your willingness to work is. And so when it comes to work, you have two choices. You can either choose to work or not work. That is, you can either choose to pursue labor or pursue leisure. Your decision about how much labor to supply will be driven by marginal analysis. You'll choose to supply labor as long as the marginal benefit of that labor in terms of wages is equal to the marginal cost in terms of the utility you lose from not working. And so equilibrium, or the optimal amount of labor that you produce and offer to the market, will be based on that decision. So let's think for a second. What would you do in a situation, for example, where your pay increased from $10 an hour to $20 an hour? Would you work more or would you work less? There are reasons to work less, surely. I mean, because you're getting paid more, you can earn the same amount or even more money than you were before in less time. So in that regard, it would make sense to work a few less hours and enjoy more leisure. Because even if you worked just one fewer hour, you'd still be making more at $20 an hour than you were at 10. But there are some good reasons for why you might want to work more. One of the main ones is because you're earning twice as much. I mean, if you're earning twice as much, you can certainly benefit from that and spend that money on a lot of things. And so you may choose to work even more hours than you were before. Because the more you work, the more you make. But at some point, economists believe that there'll be a place at which it's just not worth it for you to work more, that you're giving up too much in terms of the benefits of leisure. And so we generally say that the labor supply curve for an individual is what we call backward bending. Why is it backward bending? There are two forces kind of at play here. One is the substitution effect, which basically tells us that the opportunity cost of leisure increases with an increase in wage, which means that it makes sense for us to supply more labor. In order to take away labor, to take away hours of work, I'm giving up too much in the form of more pay, and so I will choose to make myself available to work longer hours. But there's also the flip side, which is the income effect. That basically, with that higher wage rate, you're feeling more wealthy, and the wealthier you feel, the less work you're inclined to pursue, and so you will choose to consume more leisure at some point. And so where that point occurs is obviously different for everybody, but generally speaking, we can say that every individual has essentially a backward bending supply curve for labor. We'll supply more when the substitution effect is greater than the income effect, and then we'll begin to offer fewer hours at some point when the wage gets high enough that the income effect overweighs the substitution effect. Once we know individual supply curves for labor, we can then create a market supply curve for labor by basically summing up or adding up the individual supply curves of people. And just like with other supply and demand, we know that if there's a change in wages, that's going to cause a movement along the supply curve. That movement is created by a shift in demand for some reason. But otherwise, a change in wage will just be a movement along the supply curve. Things might cause the supply curve to shift, however, and those kinds of changes are things like a change in preferences. For example, if the if society says it's okay now for women to work like it did in World War II, we're going to see lots of women enter the workforce where they weren't in it before, and the supply of labor, the total number of people willing to work at a certain wage, increases. Or we could see a change in population. And again, with World War II, with a huge increase in population as a result of the baby boom, we saw that there are more workers willing to work at any given wage rate as before, and so that means that the supply is shifted to the right. Or maybe there's a change in opportunities. And so, maybe there are new jobs out there that people are now interested in, and maybe they choose to enter the workforce because now there's something they really want to pursue. And then also changes in wealth may have an impact. For example, in the opposite direction, teenagers who have families with an increase in income may feel like they don't need to work as much during the summer because their parents are able to pay for the things that they want. And so we may actually see the market labor supply curve shift not to the right but to the left when people feel wealthier. We'll find equilibrium in the labor market by finding the intersection between the market labor supply curve and the market labor demand curve, and where they intersect will be the equilibrium value for the marginal product of labor and our equilibrium employment. We're assuming in this case that it's perfect competition, and so everyone will be paid the same wage rate, W star, on the graph. There are times, however, where we might be talking about a market that's not perfectly competitive. Everything we talked about before has been perfectly competitive, where we are assuming the same price for the good, and we're assuming the same wage rate for the worker, but that's not always the case. You do have examples of imperfect competition in both the labor supply and labor demand situations. So we can make a more general argument about the profit maximizing amount of labor that's demanded. We can talk about what's known as the marginal revenue product. The marginal revenue product is the marginal product of the last laborer. How much did they increase production by for that last person hired, times the marginal revenue for the good that they're producing. So marginal revenue is not always the same as price. Remember that marginal revenue is less than price in something like monopoly or monopolistic competition. So it's just a little bit more general, but the fact still remains that it's just like the value of the marginal product of labor in a perfectly competitive market. It's still telling us how much money is this last worker bringing in to the company. So it's still the same idea, just a little bit different vocabulary. It's just a little bit more general as a rule. We also know then that the profit maximizing amount of labor is going to be equal to the marginal revenue product when the amount of money brought in, the marginal benefit, is equal to the marginal cost. But in a imperfectly competitive market, the marginal cost of labor is going to be different depending on how many people are hired. Unlike in a perfectly competitive environment in which everyone is paid the same wage, we may find ourselves in a situation in which everyone is not paid the same wage, in which case we talk about what's called the marginal factor cost. And that just looks at the additional cost of hiring one more person. So we look at their wage rate for that last worker. And essentially the wage rate's going to have to go up for each worker we hire because we're going to have to try and would have to pay more to get somebody else to be willing to work. We find this as an example, something called a monopsony. In a monopsony, there is a single demander of labor. A basic example of a monopsony is maybe there's a town where there's only one employer. Maybe it's a company town, in which case there's only one demander of labor, and if they want to get more people to work for them, they're going to have to hire people at higher wages. And so each additional worker kind of needs more wages to get them to want to work, and so that's going to raise the cost of production. And so you don't have a standard wage, you'd have kind of an increasing wage rate. And so that's what we mean by marginal factor cost. So, for example, we could look and say 1 unit of labor costs us $8 in wages, but in order to get an additional person to work, I'd have to hire them at $9 an hour, which is going to raise the wage for everybody. So our total labor cost is now $18 instead of $8. And if I wanted 3 workers, I'd have to offer a wage of $10 to get 3 people to want to work, and that would increase my total labor cost to $30, and then so on down the line. So then my marginal factor cost is the increased cost of hiring laborers. And so for the first laborer, it's $8. I went from 0 when I had no workers to $8 when I hired 1. My marginal factor cost for 2 workers is going to be 10. My total labor costs increased by $10 when I hired the second worker. The marginal factor cost for the third worker then is $12 because I went from $18 in total labor costs to $30. So my labor costs increased by 12 when I hired an additional worker. And then for 4 workers, it's 14, 16, and so on. So then my profit maximizing amount of labor will be where my marginal revenue product, the amount of money that the last worker brings in, is equal to the marginal factor cost, the additional cost associated with hiring that last unit of labor. And so regardless of whether you're in perfect competition or imperfect competition, this more general rule kind of captures both situations. We'll do some more practice looking at these concepts in class, and I will see you then.